Colonel Marcus Brennan had seen plenty of recruits come through Fort Richardson, but none quite like Riley Chun. At barely 5 feet 2 inches and weighing maybe 110 pounds soaking wet, she looked more like someone's kid sister than a soldier. When she first walked into his office that sweltering Georgia morning, Brennan couldn't help but shake his head. The Army's diversity initiatives had gone too far, he thought. This girl wouldn't last a week in real combat. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What he didn't know was that in just 6 months, this same small recruit would be carrying his own wounded son through 15 miles of hostile Colombian jungle, saving not just one life, but an entire squad from certain death. The mistake happened during what should have been routine training exercises. At Fort Richardson, Riley Chun had been assigned to Bravo Company, 3rd Battalion, where she immediately became the subject of countless jokes and skeptical glances. The other soldiers, all towering over her by at least 6 inches, nicknamed her Pocket, not out of affection, but as a constant reminder of her perceived inadequacy. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison, a grizzled veteran with 2 tours in Afghanistan under his belt, made no effort to hide his disdain. During morning PT, he'd deliberately place Riley at the front of formation runs, hoping she'd fall behind and wash out. During weapons training, he'd assign her the heaviest gear, watching with barely concealed amusement as she struggled with equipment designed for men twice her size. "Chun, you're holding up the entire platoon," Morrison would bark during obstacle course runs. "Maybe you should consider a desk job in supply." But Riley never complained. She'd grown up as the youngest of 4 kids in a working-class family. Sacramento, where her father ran a small auto repair shop and her mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Being underestimated was nothing new. Her 3 older brothers had spent years trying to prove she couldn't keep up with them, in sports, in academics, in anything that mattered. Each time, she'd proven them wrong through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to endure. The real test came during a field training exercise in the Appalachian foothills. Colonel Brennan had designed the operation himself, a 3-day survival and reconnaissance mission that would push his soldiers to their absolute limits. The scenario involved a simulated enemy position deep in mountainous terrain, where teams would need to gather intelligence while evading hostile forces. Played by instructors from the Special Forces Training Group, Brennan assigned Riley to Team Delta, led by his own son, Lieutenant David Brennan. David was everything his father wanted in a soldier: 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of natural leadership that came from growing up in a military family. He'd graduated top of his class from West Point and was being fast-tracked for special operations training. "Dad, seriously?" David had protested privately when he learned about Riley's assignment. "She's going to get someone killed out there." "That's exactly what I'm counting on," his father had replied grimly. "Better she learns her limitations here than in actual combat." The mission began at dawn on a Monday in late October. The autumn air was crisp and fog hung low in the valleys as the teams dispersed into the wilderness. Team Delta consisted of David, Riley, and 4 other soldiers. Corporal Tommy Nash, a communications specialist from Texas. Private First Class Marcus Williams, a medic from Detroit. Sergeant Luis Rodriguez, a weapons expert from New Mexico. And Private Sarah Mitchell, a sharpshooter from Montana. From the start, the team dynamics were strained. David made it clear that Riley would be handling basic tasks, carrying extra water, managing the radio equipment, staying in the rear during any tactical movements. The others seemed fine with this arrangement, viewing her as more of a liability than an asset. First day went smoothly enough. They established their base camp in a concealed position overlooking the target valley, set up their observation post, and began gathering the required intelligence on enemy movements. Riley performed her assigned duties without complaint, though. She couldn't help but notice several tactical errors in their positioning that the others had missed. Their observation post was too exposed on the eastern flank, vulnerable to detection from the ridgeline above. The radio antenna was positioned where it could be spotted by aircraft. Most critically, their escape route led directly through a natural choke point that could easily become a kill zone if they were discovered. But when Riley tried to voice these concerns, she was quickly shut down. "Leave the tactical thinking to those of us who actually know what we're doing," David had said dismissively. "Just focus on your equipment checks." By the second day, Riley's predictions began proving accurate. A hostile patrol nearly discovered their position during a routine sweep, forcing them to scramble for cover. Later, simulated enemy aircraft detected their radio signature, compromising their communications. Each near miss could have been avoided if they'd listened to her suggestions. The breaking point came on the third morning. Team Delta was preparing to extract from their position when they received an urgent message. A wounded soldier scenario had been added to the exercise. One member of each team would be designated as critically injured, and the team would need to evacuate them while still avoiding enemy detection. David drew the short straw. According to the exercise parameters, Lieutenant Brennan had suffered severe leg injuries from an improvised explosive device. He was conscious but couldn't walk, requiring immediate medical evacuation. The team had to transport him over 12 miles of mountainous terrain to reach the extraction point, all while avoiding multiple enemy patrols that were now actively hunting them. The scenario was designed to be nearly impossible. The route to the extraction point wound through dense forest, across rocky creek beds, and over two significant ridge lines. Carrying a full-grown man over that distance would challenge even the strongest soldiers, and with enemy forces closing in, speed was essential. Corporal Nash took charge of the evacuation plan. Based on standard Army doctrine, they would fashion a makeshift stretcher from branches and rope, with team members rotating carrying duties. Rayleigh was assigned to scout ahead and maintain communications, essentially keeping her away from the heavy lifting. But as they began the evacuation, it quickly became apparent that the stretcher method wouldn't work. The terrain was too rough, the undergrowth too thick. The makeshift stretcher constantly snagged on branches, and the bearers couldn't maintain any meaningful pace. After just half a mile, they were already falling behind schedule. "We need to try something else," Riley suggested during a brief rest. "The stretcher isn't working in this terrain." "What do you suggest, Pocket?" Nash replied sarcastically. "We just leave the lieutenant behind. Someone needs to carry him," she said simply. "Fireman's carry or over-the-shoulder transport. It's the only way we're going to make time." The men looked at each other skeptically. David, despite being designated as injured, couldn't help but speak up from his position on the stretcher. "Nash, Rodriguez, you're both big enough. Take turns every half mile or so." But after another hour of grueling progress, it became clear that even the strongest team members were struggling. Nash managed barely a quarter mile before he was gasping for breath. Rodriguez fared slightly better, but was clearly exhausted after his stint. Williams and Mitchell tried, but neither had the upper body strength for the task. Meanwhile, simulated enemy forces were closing in. Their radio crackled with reports of hostile patrols sweeping the area, systematically checking every possible route to the extraction point. At their current pace, they would never make it to safety before being captured or killed. That's when Riley made a decision that would change everything. "Let me try," she said quietly. The team stared at her in disbelief. "Are you insane?" David asked from his stretcher position. "You can barely carry your own pack." "I've been watching everyone's technique," Riley replied, already moving to help him up. "You're all trying to power through with upper body strength. But this isn't about being the strongest. It's about efficiency, balance, and endurance." Before anyone could Stop her. She had David positioned across her shoulders in a modified fireman's carry, distributing his weight in a way that engaged her core and leg muscles rather than just her arms and back. And then she started moving, to everyone's amazement. Rayleigh's pace was not just sustainable, it was fast. She moved through the forest with a fluid, almost effortless motion, her compact frame allowing her to duck under branches that would have caught taller soldiers. Her low center of gravity gave her better stability on uneven terrain. Most importantly, she seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of endurance. Mile after mile, she continued at the same steady pace, only occasionally pausing for water or to check their position. The other team members, no longer burdened with carrying duties, could focus on security and navigation. Their progress improved dramatically. As they approached the halfway point of their journey, Nash finally asked the question they were all thinking. "Chun, where the hell did you learn to do this?" Riley smiled grimly, adjusting David's position across her shoulders without breaking stride. "4 older brothers and a stubborn streak," she replied. "Plus 3 years on my high school wrestling team. Turns out being small has some advantages when you know how to use leverage properly." For the first time since the exercise began, David Brennan found himself genuinely impressed by the soldier carrying him. And in the back of his mind, he began to wonder what his father would think when he learned that the recruit he'd written off as too small had just accomplished something none of the bigger, stronger soldiers could manage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But their real test was still ahead. The enemy patrols were getting closer, and the most dangerous part of their journey lay between them and the extraction point. The jungle was about to become a whole lot more hostile. The enemy patrol appeared just as Team Delta crested the second ridgeline. 3 figures in camouflage emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, their weapons raised and pointed directly at the exhausted soldiers. In a real combat situation, they would all be dead. "Contact front," Nash shouted, though it was far too late for tactical responses. The exercise instructors playing enemy forces had been tracking them for the past hour, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. "Weapons down, hands visible," commanded the lead instructor, Sergeant First Class Maria Santos from the Covey Special Forces Training Group. "Team Delta, you've been compromised. Mission failed." David felt his heart sink as Riley carefully lowered him to the ground. They'd come so far, covered nearly 8 miles of brutal terrain, and now it was over. The exercise had been designed to be nearly impossible, and they'd just proven the point, but Riley wasn't ready to give up. "Sergeant Santos," she called out. "Respectfully, request clarification on rules of engagement." Santos raised an eyebrow. Most soldiers accepted defeat gracefully when caught during training exercises. "What's your question, Private?" The scenario briefing stated we were carrying a wounded soldier through hostile territory. "Are we operating under full combat protocols or training safety restrictions?" "Full combat protocols," Santos replied. "Why?" Riley's mind was already working. In actual combat, soldiers didn't simply surrender when discovered by enemy forces. They fought, they used every advantage available, and they completed their mission at all costs. If this was supposed to simulate real warfare, then training rules were just guidelines. "In that case," Riley said quietly, "we're not done yet." What happened next would be talked about in Fort Richardson for years to come. Riley had noticed something the others missed during their approach to the ridgeline. The enemy patrol's position, while tactically sound for an ambush, had one critical flaw. They were positioned uphill from a loose scree slope that dropped into a narrow ravine. One well-placed disruption could send rocks cascading down, creating chaos and confusion. Without warning, Riley grabbed a fist-sized stone and hurled it with precision at a precarious boulder formation 20 yards above the enemy position. Her years playing baseball with her brothers had given her an excellent throwing arm. and the rock struck exactly where she'd aimed. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The impact triggered a small avalanche of loose stones that came tumbling down toward the enemy patrol. It wasn't dangerous, the rocks were too small, and the distance too great for serious injury, but it created exactly the distraction Riley needed. Move! She yelled, grabbing David under the arms and hauling him toward a depression in the ground that she'd spotted during their approach. The rest of Team Delta reacted instinctively, following her lead as the enemy instructors scrambled to avoid the falling debris. In the confusion, the team managed to reach concealment behind a natural rock formation. Sergeant Santos's voice carried across the ridge. "Clever, but you're still surrounded. You've got nowhere to go." She was right. The enemy patrol held the high ground, controlling the only viable route to the extraction point. Even if Team Delta could avoid immediate capture, they were effectively trapped. That's when Riley revealed the second part of her plan. During her scouting duties over the past 3 days, she'd been doing more than just checking for enemy patrols. Her compact size had allowed her to explore areas that larger soldiers couldn't access, and she'd discovered an alternate route that no one else knew about. A narrow game trail that wound through a series of natural caves and emerged nearly a mile closer to the extraction point. The trail was dangerous, requiring soldiers to crawl through tight spaces and navigate unstable rock formations. Most importantly, it was completely off the official exercise maps, meaning the enemy forces had no idea it existed. "There's another way," Riley whispered to her teammates. "But you're not going to like it." She outlined her discovery quickly. A hidden passage that would allow them to bypass the enemy entirely. The catch was that the trail was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and several sections required crawling through spaces that would challenge even Riley's small frame. "You want us to do what?" Nash whispered back in disbelief. "Crawl through some cave system you found, with a wounded man?" "It's our only option," Riley replied. "Unless you'd prefer to surrender and fail the exercise." David, despite being designated as injured, found himself making the tactical decision. "How sure are you about this route?" "I've been through it twice," Riley said. "It's doable, but it'll take everything we have." The lieutenant looked at his team members, seeing doubt and exhaustion in their faces. Then he looked at Riley, barely 5 feet tall, who just carried him 8 miles without complaint and somehow outmaneuvered a special forces patrol using nothing but quick thinking and a well-thrown rock. "Do it," he decided. What followed was the most grueling physical challenge any of them had ever experienced. Riley led the way through the hidden trail, her small size allowing her to move through passages that forced the others to remove their equipment and squeeze through inch by inch. Behind her, the team members took turns helping transport David through the narrow spaces, sometimes pushing, sometimes pulling, always struggling. The first cave section dropped them into near-total darkness. Their flashlights created eerie shadows on the rock walls as they navigated through chambers that seemed to go on forever. The air was thick and humid, making breathing difficult. Rodriguez, despite his combat experience, found himself fighting claustrophobia as they crawled through a passage so narrow that his shoulders scraped against both walls. "I can't do this," Mitchell whispered during a particularly tight squeeze. "I'm stuck." Riley immediately crawled back to help, using techniques she'd learned during wilderness training to help the larger soldier navigate the constricted space. "Exhale completely," she coached quietly. "Turn your shoulders at an angle. Trust your equipment to follow your body." Inch by inch, they made progress. Riley's navigation skills proved flawless. She'd memorized every turn, every obstacle, every potential hazard. When they encountered a section where the ceiling dropped so low that even she had to army crawl, she guided each team member through with patience and precision. The most challenging moment came when they reached an underground stream that cut across their path. The water was waist-deep and flowing fast, with slippery rocks creating treacherous footing. Crossing with a wounded man seemed impossible. "I'll go first," Riley volunteered. "Establish a rope line across the current." Using the team's climbing rope, she made her way across the stream, fighting the current with every step. Her light weight actually worked against her here. The water nearly swept her off her feet twice. But her low center of gravity and experience with rough terrain helped her maintain balance where a taller person might have fallen. Once across, she secured the rope to a solid anchor point and called back, "Send David first. If anyone's going to fall, he needs to be on this side where I can help." The process of getting the wounded lieutenant across the stream took nearly 30 minutes. Riley had to guide his movements from the far side while Nash and Rodriguez supported him from behind. At one point, David lost his footing on the slippery rocks and would have been swept downstream if not for Riley's quick reflexes in grabbing the rope and bracing against the current. When they finally reached the cave exit, emerging into daylight, on the far side of the enemy position, the entire team was exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud. But they were also alive, undetected, and within striking distance of the extraction point. "How much further?" Williams asked, checking his watch. They had less than 2 hours remaining before the exercise deadline. Riley consulted her map and compass. 3 miles, mostly downhill. "We can make it if we push hard." But their ordeal was far from over. The final 3 miles included the steepest terrain of the entire route, a series of switchbacks that dropped nearly 1,000 feet through dense forest. With David still unable to walk, someone would need to carry him down paths that were treacherous even for unencumbered soldiers. "My turn," Nash volunteered, stepping forward to take over carrying duties. "No," Riley said simply. "I've got him." "Chun, you've done enough," Rodriguez protested. "You've been carrying him for hours. Let someone else take over." But Riley was already helping David position himself across her shoulders again. The truth was, she'd found a rhythm that worked, and changing carriers now would slow them down. More importantly, she'd begun to understand something about herself during this exercise. She was stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for, including herself. The descent began with Riley in the lead, moving with sure-footed precision down paths that seemed impossibly steep. Her teammates followed, weapons ready, maintaining security while marveling at the small soldier's seemingly endless endurance. Halfway down the mountainside, they encountered their final challenge. A washout had destroyed a section of the trail, leaving a gap of nearly 20 feet across a rocky gorge. The drop wasn't fatal, maybe 30 feet to a boulder-strewn creek bed, but a fall would certainly result in serious injuries. "End of the line," Nash said grimly. "There's no way across." But Riley was already studying the problem, her engineering mindset analyzing angles and possibilities. "There," she pointed to a fallen tree that bridged most of the gap. "It won't support much weight, but it'll get us across." The log was barely 8 inches in diameter and slick with moss. Crossing alone would be dangerous. Crossing while carrying another person seemed impossible. "Absolutely not," David said from his position on her shoulders. "Riley, this is insane. Even if you make it across, what if the log breaks? Then we both fall," she replied matter-of-factly. "But if we don't try, we definitely fail the mission." Before anyone could stop her, Riley stepped onto the makeshift bridge. The log immediately sagged under their combined weight, creaking ominously as she began working her way across. Step by careful step, she moved forward, using her arms for balance while David held perfectly still to avoid shifting their center of gravity. The crossing took less than 2 minutes, but felt like hours. When Riley finally stepped onto solid ground on the far side, the entire team released a collective breath they didn't realize they'd been holding. "How?" Williams called across the gap as the others prepared to make their own crossings. Riley looked back at him. David still positioned. Across her shoulders, and for the first time in 3 days, she allowed herself a small smile. "Sometimes being small is exactly what you need to be," she replied. One by one, the rest of Team Delta made their way across the fallen log, though each crossing was significantly easier without the additional weight of a wounded soldier. As the last team member reached safety, Riley was already consulting her map again. "Extraction point is just over that ridge," she announced. 20 minutes if we move fast." But as they prepared for the final push, their radios crackled to life with an unexpected transmission. "All exercise units, this is Base Command. We have a real-world emergency developing. Exercise terminated immediately. All personnel return to designated rally points for accountability and further instructions." The team members looked at each other in confusion. Real emergencies didn't interrupt major training exercises unless something serious was happening. "What kind of emergency?" Nash asked Dot as if in answer. The distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed across the mountains, growing steadily louder. Through the trees, they could see aircraft moving toward their location at high speed. Riley helped David to the ground as the lead helicopter approached their position. Whatever was happening, their exercise was definitely over. But as the aircraft landed in a clearing 50 yards away, she couldn't shake the feeling that their real test was just beginning. The helicopter's crew chief jogged toward them, his expression grim. "Team Delta? We need you to come with us immediately. There's been an incident at Fort Richardson. Colonel Brennan wants to see you personally." As they climbed aboard the aircraft, Riley found herself wondering what could possibly be so urgent that it would interrupt the major training exercise and require the colonel's immediate attention. She was about to find out that sometimes training scenarios have a way of becoming all too real. The helicopter touched down at Fort Richardson's main airfield just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the tarmac. As Team Delta disembarked, Riley immediately noticed the unusual level of activity around the base. Military police vehicles were positioned at every checkpoint, and soldiers moved with a kind of urgency that suggested something far more serious than a training accident. Colonel Brennan was waiting for them at the landing zone, but the man who approached their helicopter bore little resemblance to the composed officer Rayleigh had met months earlier. His uniform was disheveled, his face drawn with exhaustion and worry. Most tellingly, his usual air of absolute authority had been replaced by something Riley had never expected to see: vulnerability. "Sir," David said, snapping to attention despite his designated wounded status from the exercise. "Team Delta, reporting as ordered." "Drop the formalities, son," Brennan replied, his voice strained. "We need to talk, all of you. Conference room A, immediately." As they walked across the base, Riley caught fragments of conversation from passing soldiers. That made her blood run cold. Words like hostage situation, American civilians, and demands not being met painted a picture that was becoming clearer with each step. The conference room was filled with maps, satellite photos, and communication equipment that hadn't been there during their previous briefings. A large monitor displayed what appeared to be aerial surveillance footage of a remote compound surrounded by dense jungle. Several officers Riley didn't recognize were studying intelligence reports with the focused intensity of people preparing for war. Colonel Brennan closed the door and turned to face Team Delta. For a moment, he simply stared at them, as if seeing his soldiers for the first time. 36 hours ago, he began, a group of American medical volunteers was taken hostage in Colombia. They were running a free clinic in a remote village near the Venezuelan border when they were captured by a rebel faction, calling themselves the Liberation Verde. Riley felt her stomach drop. This wasn't about training exercises or proving herself anymore. Real lives were at stake. The hostages include Dr. Sarah Martinez from Atlanta, nurse practitioner James Wilson from Oregon, and 2 medical students, Jennifer Hayes from UCLA and Michael Chun from Johns Hopkins. Brennan paused, his eyes finding Riley's. Michael. Chun is 22 years old. He's also your cousin. The words hit Riley like a physical blow. Michael, her father's brother's son. The pre-med student who'd always been the family's golden child. The cousin who'd encouraged her to join the army when everyone else thought she was crazy. He was supposed to be doing his summer medical mission in a safe, peaceful village, not caught up in some guerrilla conflict. Sir, Nash said, what does this have to do with us? Shouldn't this be a job for Delta Force or Navy SEALs? Brennan turned to the large monitor and pressed a remote control. The satellite image zoomed in, revealing details of the compound where the hostages were being held. It was a nightmare scenario for conventional rescue operations. The buildings were scattered across a valley floor, surrounded by dense jungle on 3 sides and sheer cliffs on the 4th. Multiple guard positions covered every approach route. The Liberation Vert isn't your typical terrorist organization, explained Major Patricia Webb, one of the intelligence officers Riley hadn't met before. They're former military, well-trained, and they know exactly how to counter standard rescue tactics. Every time we've tried to get close, they've detected our presence and threatened to execute the hostages. But sir, Rodriguez interjected, we're just a training unit. We don't have the experience for this kind of mission. Colonel Brennan's expression darkened. That's exactly why you're perfect for it. The enemy is expecting elite special operations forces, heavily armed teams using conventional infiltration methods. They're not expecting a small, unconventional unit that can approach through terrain they consider impassable. Riley was beginning to understand where this was leading, but the full scope of what Brennan was suggesting seemed impossible. The compound sits at the end of a valley that's surrounded by jungle so dense that satellites can barely penetrate the canopy, Webb continued. There are only 2 known access routes, a main road that's heavily guarded, and a river approach that's covered by machine gun positions. But intelligence suggests there might be a third option. The satellite image shifted to show the mountainous region surrounding the compound. Webb used a laser pointer to indicate a series of ridgelines that seemed to connect with the target area. Indigenous hunters have reported the existence of old smuggler trails through these mountains, paths that would be impossible for conventional forces to navigate, but might be accessible to a very small, highly motivated team. How small? David asked, though Riley suspected he already knew the answer. 2 people, Brennan replied, maximum. The trails apparently involve cave systems, rope climbs, and passages that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Any more than 2 would be impossible to conceal, and the routes are too dangerous for larger groups anyway. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They were talking about sending 2 soldiers into hostile territory to attempt a rescue mission that trained special operations units had deemed too risky. Sir, Williams said carefully, even if such a mission were possible, the team would need extensive jungle warfare training, language skills, and specialized equipment we don't have. Actually, said a new voice from the doorway, the team would need something more important than any of that. Everyone turned as Sergeant First Class Maria Santos entered the room, the Special Forces instructor who had captured them during the exercise. Now wore a different expression, one of professional respect mixed with grim determination. I've been reviewing your performance during the training exercise, Santos continued, addressing Team Delta. Specifically, I've been analyzing how Private Chun managed to transport Lieutenant Brennan through 8 miles of difficult terrain while evading detection. Her methods were unconventional. Santos moved to the front of the room and pulled up a new set of maps on the monitor. These showed detailed topographical information of the Colombian mountains, with elevation markers and terrain features highlighted in different colors. The smuggler trails I mentioned aren't just difficult, they're specifically designed to defeat people of average size and strength. The original smugglers who created these routes were indigenous people of small stature who could move through spaces that would stop larger individuals. Most of the passages require someone who weighs less than 120 pounds and can fit through openings that are barely 18 inches wide. Riley suddenly understood why she was in this room. It wasn't about her performance during the exercise, though that had certainly played a role. It was about her physical size and the unique capabilities that came with it. The question, Santos continued, is whether Private Chun has the skills and mental toughness to handle a mission of this magnitude. Based on what I observed during your exercise, I believe she does. Colonel Brennan stepped forward, his expression mixing hope with desperation. Chun, I won't order you to do this. The mission is completely voluntary, and the risks are significant. But you may be the only person who can reach those hostages before it's too late. Riley felt the weight of every eye in the room. 6 months ago, these same people had written her off as too small, too weak, too inexperienced to be a real soldier. Now they were asking her to attempt a mission that seasoned special operations forces wouldn't touch. What about the second team member? She asked, her voice steadier than she felt. That would be me, Santos replied. I have extensive experience in jungle warfare, speak fluent Spanish, and I'm small enough to make the journey. More importantly, I know how to coordinate with extraction teams and handle the tactical aspects of a hostage rescue. Riley looked around the room at her teammates from Delta Team, Nash, Rodriguez, Williams, Mitchell, all of them staring at her with expressions that had changed completely from the skepticism and dismissal of just days before. Now she saw something she'd never expected, confidence in her abilities. The timeline? Riley asked. 18 hours, Brennan replied grimly. Intelligence indicates the rebels are planning to move the hostages to a new location tomorrow night. Once they're moved, we may never find them again. Major Webb stepped forward with a briefing folder. The insertion would be tonight. A helicopter would drop you 20 miles from the target, at the base of the mountain range. From there, you'd have approximately 10 hours to navigate the smuggler trails, reach the compound, locate the hostages, and signal for extraction. And if something goes wrong? David asked, his concern for Riley evident despite their complicated history. Santos answered without hesitation. Then 2 more Americans disappear into the Colombian jungle, and the original hostages are likely executed as soon as the rebels realize there's been an infiltration attempt. The room fell silent again. Riley closed her eyes and thought about Michael, brilliant, kind-hearted Michael who'd chosen to spend his summer helping people in a remote village instead of taking some lucrative internship. She thought about the other hostages, people who'd volunteered to provide medical care to those who couldn't afford it. She thought about her father, working endless hours in his auto repair shop to support his family. Her mother, pulling double shifts at the hospital to help other people's children. Her 3 brothers who'd spent years testing her limits and inadvertently preparing her for exactly this moment. Most of all, she thought about the question that had haunted her since joining the army. What was she really capable of when everything was on the line? I'll do it, she said quietly. Chun, Nash said, you don't have to prove anything to anybody. You've already shown. This isn't about proving anything. Riley interrupted, opening her eyes and looking directly at Colonel Brennan. This is about bringing those people home. Brennan nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd met him, Riley saw something approaching respect in his expression. All right then, he said. Santos, you have 4 hours to brief Chun on jungle warfare tactics and hostage rescue protocols. The helicopter leaves at 0200 hours. As the meeting broke up and officers began coordinating mission details, David approached Riley quietly. For what it's worth, he said, I think you're the right person for this job, maybe the only person who could pull it off. Riley looked at the lieutenant, the colonel's son who doubted her capabilities from day one, who'd been carried through 8 miles of brutal terrain by the soldier everyone called too small. "Thank you, sir," she replied. "That means more than you know." But as the room emptied and the reality of what she'd agreed to sink in, Riley couldn't help wondering if confidence and determination would be enough. In less than 18 hours, she'd either be celebrating the successful rescue of 4 American civilians, or she'd be dead in a Colombian jungle alongside the people she'd tried to save. Either way, everyone who'd ever underestimated her was about to find out exactly what she was made of. The mission briefing began immediately. Santos spread out detailed maps of the infiltration route, showing Riley satellite photos of terrain features, potential hazards, and rally points. The smuggler trails wound through some of the most challenging topography on Earth: vertical rock faces that required technical climbing, underground river systems that could flood without warning, and passages so narrow that equipment would have to be carried rather than worn. "The good news," Santos explained, "is that the rebels have no idea these routes exist. They've positioned all their security around the known approaches. The bad news is that if we get lost or injured, there's no way to call for help. We'll be completely on our own until we reach the extraction point." Riley studied the maps, her mind already working through the challenges they'd face. The route was approximately 12 miles of the most difficult terrain she could imagine, with a total elevation change of nearly 4,000 feet. Parts of the journey would require them to rappel down cliff faces in complete darkness. Other sections involved crawling through underground passages that might or might not be stable. "The hostages are being held in the main building here," Santos continued, pointing to the satellite image of the compound. "Intelligence suggests they're all in one room, guarded by at least 4 rebels at all times. The building has 1 main entrance and 2 windows, both of which are barred." "How do we get them out?" Riley asked. "Very carefully," Santos replied, "and very quietly. The extraction plan depends on us neutralizing the guards without alerting the rest of the compound. Once we have the hostages, we signal the helicopter and move to this landing zone." She indicated a clearing about half a mile from the compound. "The timing has to be perfect. Any delay, and the other rebels will converge on our position." As they worked through the details, Riley found herself entering a state of focused calm that she'd never experienced before. The magnitude of the mission was terrifying, but it was also clarifying. All the doubts, all the questions about whether she belonged in the army, all the uncertainty about her capabilities, none of that mattered now. There were people who needed help, and she was uniquely qualified to provide it. The equipment check took another hour. Because of the constraints of the smuggler trails, they could carry only the most essential gear: lightweight climbing equipment, a minimal medical kit, communications gear, and just enough food and water to sustain them during the infiltration. Weapons were limited to sidearms and a few flashbang grenades. Anything larger would be impossible to transport through the narrow passages they'd encounter. "Remember," Santos said as they completed their preparations, "once we start this mission, there's no turning back. The terrain won't allow for retreat, and the rebels won't give us a second chance if we're discovered." Riley nodded, checking her gear one final time. In 2 hours, she'd be boarding a helicopter bound for Colombia, embarking on a mission that would either make her a hero or get her killed. As she prepared to leave the briefing room, Colonel Brennan appeared in the doorway. "One last time." "Shun," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I judged you based on your appearance instead of your character. That was wrong." "Sir," Riley replied, "we all make mistakes. What matters is what we do when it counts." Brennan extended his hand. "Bring them home, soldier." Riley shook his hand firmly. "Yes, sir. That's exactly what I intend to do." The Black Hawk helicopter cut through the Colombian night like a shadow, flying OE-nap of the Earth to avoid radar detection. Riley pressed her face against the small window, watching the jungle canopy blur past in the darkness below. Somewhere in that vast green expanse, 4 Americans were waiting for rescue. Unaware that their lives now depended on a soldier most people considered too small for real combat, Santos sat across from her, methodically checking their gear one final time. The veteran instructor had been unusually quiet during the flight, and Riley could sense the weight of responsibility she was carrying. This wasn't a training exercise where mistakes meant failing grades. Every decision they made in the next few hours could mean the difference between life and death. 5 minutes out, the pilot announced through their headsets. Riley's stomach tightened, but not from fear. It was anticipation, the same feeling she'd had before wrestling matches in high school, when she knew she was facing a stronger opponent. The key was never to let size determine the outcome. It was about speed, technique, and refusing to quit when things got difficult. The helicopter began its descent toward a small clearing barely visible in the moonlight. According to their intelligence, this landing zone was 22 miles from the rebel compound, far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to reach the target within their time window. "Remember," Santos said through the headset, "once we're on the ground, radio silence until we reach the compound. The rebels have been monitoring military frequencies, and any transmission could give away our position." The aircraft touched down with barely a whisper, its specially modified rotors designed for stealth operations. Rayleigh and Santos quickly disembarked, their gear secured in lightweight packs that would allow maximum mobility through the challenging terrain ahead. As the helicopter lifted off and disappeared into the night, the two soldiers found themselves alone in a landscape that seemed hostile to human presence. The jungle around them was alive with sounds, insects, birds, and the distant calls of animals Riley couldn't identify. The air was thick and humid, already making her clothing stick to her skin despite the relatively cool night temperature. Santos consulted her GPS and compass, then pointed toward a barely visible break in the tree line. "The trail starts about half a mile that way. From here on, we follow the route the smugglers used for 50 years. They moved through the initial stretch of jungle in single file, Santos leading with Riley close behind. The vegetation was so dense that visibility dropped to just a few yards, even with their night vision equipment. Every step required careful placement to avoid loose rocks, exposed roots, or the countless vines that seemed designed to trip unwary travelers. After 30 minutes of careful navigation, they reached the beginning of the smuggler trail proper. What Riley saw made her understand why conventional forces had never attempted this approach. The trail was little more than a series of handholds, carved into a nearly vertical rock face that disappeared upward into darkness. "This is where it gets interesting," Santos whispered, pulling out climbing gear. "The first section is a 200-foot vertical ascent. No ropes, the smugglers used only what they could carry." Rayleigh studied the rock face, identifying potential handholds and foot placements. Her small hands were actually an advantage here. She could grip narrow ledges that would be impossible for larger climbers to use effectively. "I lead," she offered. "If the holds won't support my weight, they definitely won't work for you." Santos nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. Test each hold carefully. Some of these routes haven't been used in years." The climb began slowly, with Riley methodically testing each handhold before committing her full weight. The rock was limestone, worn smooth by decades of weather, but still solid enough to support careful climbers. Her years of wrestling had given her exceptional upper body strength relative to her size, and she found herself moving up the cliff face with growing confidence. About halfway up, she encountered the first real challenge. A section of the rock face had partially collapsed, leaving a gap of nearly 6 feet between stable holds. For a taller climber, it might have been manageable with a dynamic move. For Riley, it required a different approach. She studied the problem for several minutes, then noticed something the original smugglers had carved into the rock: shallow grooves that formed a diagonal crack leading across the gap. The holds were barely large enough for fingertips, but they provided just enough purchase for someone with small hands and excellent technique. Riley made the traverse carefully, her feet finding tiny ledges while her fingers maintained a death grip on the minimal holds. Behind her, Santos watched with professional admiration as the small soldier solved a problem that would have stopped most climbers. "How?" Santos asked when they regrouped at the top of the cliff. "Gymnastics classes." "When I was 8, Riley replied with a slight smile. "My mom thought it would help with coordination. Turns out she was right." The trail continued along a narrow ridge line that required them to traverse sections where the path was barely 18 inches wide, with drop-offs on both sides that disappeared into darkness. Riley's low center of gravity proved advantageous. Again, she could maintain balance on surfaces that would challenge taller hikers. 2 hours into their journey, they reached the cave system that would take them through the heart of the mountain range. The entrance was hidden behind a curtain of vines, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside, the passage narrowed immediately, forcing them to remove their packs and push them ahead as they crawled through spaces that seemed impossibly tight. "This is where we find out if the intelligence was accurate," Santos muttered as they squeezed through a section where the ceiling dropped to less than 3 feet. The cave system was a maze of interconnected passages that wound through the mountain for nearly 2 miles. Some sections opened into chambers large enough to stand upright. Others required army crawling through spaces so narrow that Riley's shoulders scraped against both walls simultaneously. The most challenging section came when they encountered an underground river that had carved a channel through the rock. The water was chest-deep and moving fast, with a current that could easily sweep an unwary traveler into the darkness downstream. There, Riley pointed to a series of metal spikes driven into the rock wall above the water line. The smugglers installed a traverse system. Using the spikes as anchor points, they rigged an improvised zip line that allowed them to cross the underground river without fighting the current. Santos went first, testing the system with her heavier weight. When she reached the far side safely, Riley followed, her lighter frame making the crossing almost effortless. They emerged from the cave system just as dawn was breaking over the Colombian mountains. According to Santos's GPS, they had covered 8 miles in 4 hours. Excellent time considering the difficulty of the terrain. More importantly, they were now within 6 miles of the rebel compound. With the most technical climbing behind them, the final approach would be different. They'd be moving through dense jungle during daylight hours, requiring complete stealth to avoid detection by rebel patrols that might be operating in the area. "From here, it's all about patience and discipline," Santos explained as they paused to eat and hydrate. "We move slowly, check every step, and assume there are hostile forces everywhere." Riley nodded, checking her weapon and communications gear. The easy part of their mission was over. Now came the real test, infiltrating a heavily guarded compound and extracting 4 hostages without getting everyone killed in the process. As they prepared to begin the final phase of their approach, Riley's radio crackled softly with an encrypted message from base command. "Package confirmed, still secure. The window closes in 6 hours. Good hunting." Her cousin Michael and the other hostages were still alive, but time was running out. Whatever the rebels were planning, it would happen soon. Riley and Santos had to reach the compound, neutralize the guards, and extract the hostages before the 6-hour deadline, or risk losing them forever. The jungle ahead looked peaceful in the morning light, but Riley knew it concealed dangers far more deadly than anything they'd faced during the night climb. Armed rebels, booby traps, and the constant threat of discovery awaited them in the green shadows ahead. She checked her equipment one final time, then looked at Santos. "Ready?" The Special Forces instructor nodded grimly. "Let's go bring them home." Together, they disappeared into the jungle, 2 small figures moving toward a confrontation that would determine whether 4 innocent people lived or died, and whether A soldier everyone called too small would prove that sometimes the most unlikely heroes are exactly what the situation demands. The jungle floor was a carpet of decomposing leaves that muffled their footsteps as Rayleigh and Santos crept through the dense undergrowth. Every shadow could conceal a rebel sentry. Every sound might be their last warning before discovery. The humidity was stifling now that the sun had risen, turning their tactical gear into a second skin of sweat and discomfort. Santos held up a closed fist, the universal military signal to halt. Through the green wall of vegetation ahead, Rayleigh could make out the first signs of human habitation, a cleared area where the natural jungle had been cut back to create fields of cultivation. According to their intelligence, the rebel compound lay just beyond those fields. Coca plants, Santos whispered, pointing to rows of distinctive bushes that stretched across several acres. That explains how they fund their operations. Rayleigh studied the plantation through her compact binoculars. The fields were divided into sections by dirt paths, with several small buildings scattered throughout the area. More importantly, she could see at least 3 armed guards patrolling the perimeter, their AK-47 rifles clearly visible even at this distance. The compound is another half-mile past the plantation, Santos continued, consulting her GPS. But we can't go around. The terrain on both sides is impassable. We'll have to move through the fields during the shift change. They settled into concealment among the thick jungle vegetation to observe the guard rotation patterns. For the next hour, they watched as the rebels maintained their security routine with military precision. These weren't amateur fighters. They moved with the discipline of trained soldiers, checking specific locations at regular intervals and maintaining overlapping fields of fire. Former Colombian Army, Santos observed quietly. Probably deserters who took their training and equipment with them. This is going to be more difficult than we anticipated. Rayleigh was studying a different aspect of the security setup. The guards were following predictable routes, but their timing was irregular, enough to prevent easy exploitation. However, she'd noticed something else. The coca plants grew in rows that were just tall enough to provide concealment for someone of her height, while still being too low to hide larger individuals. There, she pointed to a section where the kin were. Cultivation rows ran directly toward the compound. If I stay low and time it right, I can move through those plants without being seen. The rows provide perfect concealment for someone my size. Santos frowned. What about me? I'm too tall. They'll spot me immediately. You create a distraction on the eastern perimeter, Rayleigh suggested. Nothing dramatic, just enough to draw their attention away from the plantation. While they're investigating, I slip through and get eyes on the compound. It was a risky plan that violated every principle of unit cohesion, but Santos recognized its tactical soundness. Rayleigh's compact frame was perfectly suited for moving through terrain that would expose larger soldiers. 30 minutes, Santos agreed. If you're not back by then, I'm coming after you. Rayleigh checked her equipment one final time, then began her approach to the plantation. The morning sun was climbing higher, and she could feel sweat beginning to pool beneath her gear. Each step required careful placement to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves that might alert the guards dot at the edge of the cultivation area. She paused to time the patrol patterns one more time. The nearest guard would pass her position in approximately 3 minutes, giving her a narrow window to cross the open ground and reach the concealment of the coca plants dot. She moved during the gap between patrols, sprinting across 20 yards of open ground and diving into the crop rows, just as she heard footsteps approaching her previous position. Her heart hammered against her ribs as a rebel soldier passed within 10 feet of her hiding spot, his boots clearly visible through the plant stems. Once the guard moved on, Rayleigh began working her way through the plantation using the natural corridors between crop rows. The plants were indeed perfect for someone of her height. She could move in a low crouch while remaining completely hidden from anyone more than a few yards away. Halfway through the plantation, she encountered an unexpected obstacle. An irrigation ditch about 4 feet wide cut across her path, filled with muddy water that would be impossible to cross quietly. The ditch stretched in both directions as far as she could see, with no obvious crossing points. Riley studied the problem, then noticed a series of concrete irrigation pipes that ran beneath the ditch at regular intervals. The pipes were barely 18 inches in diameter, too small for most adults, but possibly large enough for someone of her size. She lowered herself into the muddy water and found the entrance to the nearest pipe. The concrete tube was slimy, with algae and just wide enough for her to squeeze through. By exhaling completely and keeping her arms pressed against her sides, it was like crawling through a sewer pipe, but it got her across the obstacle without creating any disturbance on the surface. Emerging on the far side of the ditch, covered in mud and algae, Riley continued through the plantation until she reached the far perimeter. Through the last row of plants, she could finally see their objective. The rebel compound was larger than the satellite photos had suggested, consisting of 6 buildings arranged around a central courtyard. The main structure, where intelligence indicated the hostages were being held, was a concrete block building with barred windows and a single entrance. Guards were positioned at regular intervals around the perimeter, with additional sentries patrolling between buildings. But what caught Riley's attention wasn't the security layout, it was the activity level. There were far more rebels in the compound than their intelligence had suggested. Instead of the expected dozen fighters, she counted at least 25 armed individuals, many of them loading equipment into vehicles as if preparing to move. Through the barred windows of the main building, she could see movement that looked like people being forced to pack belongings. The hostages were definitely inside, but the rebels were clearly preparing to transport them to a new location, possibly within hours. Not the anticipated evening timeline. Riley needed to get this information back to Santos immediately, but as she prepared to retreat through the plantation, she heard voices approaching her position. 2 guards were walking directly toward her hiding spot, engaged in animated conversation in Spanish. She pressed herself deeper into the crop rows, hoping the vegetation would provide enough concealment. The guards stopped just a few feet from her position, apparently taking a break from their patrol duties. One of them lit a cigarette while the other consulted what appeared to be a watch. Transportation arrives at 1400 hours, she heard one guard say in Spanish. The prisoners need to be ready to move by then. Riley's blood ran cold. 1400 hours was 2 p.m. in less than 4 hours. Their carefully planned evening assault was now useless. If they were going to save the hostages, they had to act immediately. The guards finished their break and moved on, but Riley remained motionless for several more minutes to ensure they were gone. Then she began the dangerous journey back through the plantation. Moving as quickly as stealth would allow. Her return trip was complicated by increased patrol activity. The rebels seemed to be tightening their security in preparation for the prisoner transfer, with guards now checking areas they'd previously ignored. Twice, Riley had to freeze in place as searchers passed within arm's reach of her hiding spot. The irrigation ditch crossing was even more challenging on the return journey. The concrete pipe was slippery with her first passage, and she found herself stuck halfway through when her gear caught on a concrete joint. For terrifying seconds, she was trapped in the narrow tube with muddy water rising around her face. She managed to work herself free by removing her pack and pushing it ahead of her, then squirming through the remaining distance using only her fingertips for traction. By the time she emerged on the far side, she was covered in mud from head to toe and gasping for breath. The final stretch through the plantation required extreme patience. The increased patrol activity meant longer gaps between safe movement opportunities. She had to wait nearly 15 minutes in one spot while guards conducted what appeared to be a systematic search of the crop rows, apparently looking for signs of intruders, when she finally reached the jungle perimeter where Santos was waiting. The Special Forces instructor took one look at her mud-covered appearance and immediately knew something had gone wrong. "What happened?" Santos whispered as Rayleigh collapsed beside her in the concealment of the thick vegetation. "They're moving the hostages at 1400 hours, Riley gasped, still catching her breath from the harrowing return journey. 4 hours from now. And there are at least 25 fighters in that compound, not the dozen we expected." Santos checked her watch, her expression grim. "That changes everything. We don't have time for a careful approach or waiting for nightfall. If we're going to extract those hostages, we have to do it now, in broad daylight, against overwhelming numbers." Riley nodded, wiping mud from her face. "The main building where they're holding the prisoners has barred windows and one entrance. Heavy guard presence, but I noticed something. The guards follow predictable patterns, and there's a blind spot on the north side of the building where the generator shed blocks their line of sight. Can we reach it without being detected?" "Maybe," Riley replied, studying the mental map she'd formed during her reconnaissance. "But we'd need a major distraction to draw most of the guards away from the central compound. Something big enough to pull their attention, but not so dramatic that they execute the hostages immediately." Santos was already thinking tactically, weighing options and risks. The coca plantation. If we can start a fire in the fields, it'll threaten their primary source of income. Every available fighter will respond to protect their crop. That could work, Riley agreed. But once we make our move, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before they realize it's a diversion. 10 minutes to get inside, neutralize the remaining guards, extract 4 hostages, and reach the extraction point. 10 minutes to do the impossible, Santos said grimly. But it's the only chance those people have. They spent the next hour developing their assault plan. Santos would circle around to the eastern edge of the plantation and create multiple ignition points using improvised incendiary devices. The fires would spread quickly in the dry morning heat, creating enough chaos to draw the majority of guards away from the compound. Meanwhile, Riley would use the confusion to approach the main building through the blind spot she'd identified. Her small size would allow her to slip through a gap in the perimeter fence that larger individuals couldn't navigate. Once inside the compound, she'd have to neutralize any remaining guards and breach the building where the hostages were held. The extraction helicopter will be standing by at the designated landing zone, Santos explained, checking their communication equipment. But they can't approach until we signal that we have control of the hostages. If this goes wrong, we're on our own until backup can reach us. Riley understood the implications. They were about to assault a heavily defended position with overwhelming odds against them. Even if everything went perfectly, their chances of success were marginal at best. But as she thought about her cousin Michael and the other innocent people trapped in that concrete building, waiting to be transported to an unknown fate, she knew they had no choice. "When do we start?" she asked. Santos looked at her watch one final time. 30 minutes. That gives us enough time to get into position and coordinate our assault. Once I light those fires, there's no turning back. Riley checked her weapon and equipment, making sure everything was secure for the desperate mission ahead. In 30 minutes, she'd either be a hero who saved 4 American lives, or she'd be dead in a Colombian jungle, another casualty of a rescue attempt that pushed beyond the limits of possibility. Either way, she was about to prove that sometimes the smallest person in the room is exactly the right size for the job that needs to be done. The first wisps of smoke began rising from the eastern edge of the coca plantation at exactly 1 p.m. Riley watched through her binoculars as Santos's incendiary devices ignited multiple fires simultaneously, sending orange flames racing through the dry crop rows. Within minutes, thick black smoke was billowing across the compound, and she could hear shouts of alarm from the rebel fighters. Their reaction was immediate and exactly what they'd hoped for. Guards abandoned their posts around the main buildings and ran toward the plantation, grabbing firefighting equipment and organizing bucket brigades to save their valuable crop. Riley counted 18 fighters responding to the emergency, leaving only a skeleton crew to guard the compound. Phase 1 complete. Santos's voice crackled softly through Riley's earpiece. You have your window. Make it count. Riley sprinted from her concealment toward the perimeter fence, her small frame allowing her to move with surprising speed across the open ground. The gap she'd identified during reconnaissance was located behind a pile of construction materials. That blocked it from view of the remaining sentries. The opening was barely 14 inches wide, a section where the chain-link fence had been damaged and hastily repaired, leaving just enough space for someone of Riley's size to squeeze through. She had to remove her pack and push it ahead of her, then contort her body to fit through the narrow gap. Once inside the compound, she found herself in the blind spot she'd observed earlier. The generator shed provided perfect concealment while she assessed the immediate threats. 2 guards remained visible, one stationed at the main building's entrance, and another patrolling the central courtyard with nervous energy as smoke continued to fill the air. Riley's plan required eliminating both guards silently before breaching the building. The courtyard sentry was closer, but also more mobile and unpredictable. The entrance guard was stationary but positioned where his elimination might be witnessed by anyone inside the building. She decided to wait for the optimal moment when both targets would be vulnerable simultaneously. Her patience was rewarded when the courtyard patrol moved behind a supply truck. At the same moment, the entrance guard turned to look toward the fires in the distance. Riley moved like a shadow, covering the distance to the courtyard sentry. In seconds, her military combat training kicked in as she approached from his blind side, using a sleeper hold that rendered him unconscious without any sound. She dragged his body behind the truck and secured his weapon before moving on to the second target. The entrance guard was more challenging because of his position, but Riley noticed that smoke from the fires was beginning to drift across the compound, providing intermittent concealment. She used the smokescreen to approach from an unexpected angle, scaling the side of the building and dropping down behind the guard from above. Her second takedown was equally silent, and within minutes she had both guards neutralized and their weapons secured. But as she prepared to breach the main building, she heard the sound that changed everything: vehicle engines starting up in the distance. Through the smoke, she could see that some of the rebels had abandoned the firefighting effort and were returning to the compound. Their leader had apparently realized that the plantation fire might be a diversion, and they were implementing contingency plans to secure the hostages immediately. Riley's 10-minute window had just collapsed to maybe 3 or 4 minutes. She had to get inside the building, locate the hostages, and begin the extraction before the returning guards discovered their unconscious comrades. The main entrance was secured with a heavy wooden door reinforced with metal straps. Riley tested it carefully and found it unlocked. The guards had apparently been relying on their presence rather than physical security to prevent escapes. She slipped inside and found herself in a narrow corridor that extended toward the back of the building. The interior was dimly lit, with only a few small windows providing natural light. More importantly, she could hear voices coming from a room at the far end of the hall. American voices speaking in hushed, frightened tones. Riley crept down the corridor, her weapon ready but hoping to avoid any gunfire that might alert the returning rebels. The building appeared to be divided into several rooms, with the hostages being held in what looked like a former storage area. At the rear, as she approached the hostage room, she could make out the conversation more clearly. Her cousin Michael's voice was unmistakable, though strained with exhaustion and fear. Helicopter earlier this morning, he was saying. Maybe it's the rescue team Sarah was talking about. Don't get our hopes up, replied a woman's voice. That must belong to Dr. Martinez. They've been moving us every few days. This could just be another transfer. Riley paused outside the door, listening for any indication of guards inside the room. She could hear only the 4 hostage voices, suggesting that the rebels had been confident enough in their perimeter security to leave the prisoners unguarded. She tested the door handle and found it locked, but the mechanism was simple enough that she could probably breach it with a single well-placed kick. However, the noise would certainly alert anyone within earshot, including the rebels who were already returning to the compound. Instead, she noticed that one of the small windows near the hostage room had damaged bars, apparently the result of some previous escape attempt. The opening was too small for most adults, but might just accommodate someone of her size. Riley worked her way around to the exterior of the building and examined the window more closely. The bars had been bent outward, creating a gap that was perhaps 16 inches at its widest point. It would be an extremely tight fit, but possible if she could remove most of her equipment first. She stripped down to just her basic gear and weapon, then began working her way through the window opening. The damaged bars scraped against her shoulders and back, but she managed to squeeze through and drop quietly into the hostage room. 4 faces stared at her in shock and disbelief. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a woman in her 40s with graying hair and intelligent eyes. James Wilson, a stocky nurse practitioner who looked like he hadn't slept in days. Jennifer Hayes, a young medical student with dirt-streaked blonde hair. And Michael Chun, her cousin, who appeared thinner than she remembered but otherwise unharmed. Riley? Michael whispered in amazement. What are you doing here? Getting you out, she replied quietly, already moving to check their physical condition. Are any of you injured? Can everyone move quickly? We're all mobile, Dr. Martinez replied, taking charge with the authority of someone accustomed to emergency situations. But there are guards everywhere. How did you get past them? Long story, Riley said, checking her watch. They had maybe 2 minutes before the returning rebels discovered the unconscious sentries. Right now we need to move. There's an extraction point half a mile from here, but we have to reach it before they realize you're gone. She quickly explained. The escape route. Back through the window. Across the compound during the confusion caused by the plantation fires. And then a rapid movement through the jungle to the helicopter landing zone. I'll go first, she said. Then help each of you through the window. Dr. Martinez, you coordinate the others. Michael, you're last. I need someone I trust to make sure everyone gets out safely. Riley squeezed back through the window opening. Her movements now practiced and efficient. Once outside, she helped each hostage navigate the tight space, using her knowledge of the window's sharp edges to guide them through safely. Dr. Martinez came through with the composed efficiency Riley expected from an experienced emergency room physician. James Wilson required more assistance due to his broader shoulders, but managed the passage without major difficulty. Jennifer Hayes, despite her exhaustion, proved surprisingly agile and quick. Michael was the most challenging because of his height, but his medical school training had kept him in good physical condition. With Riley guiding him from outside and the others helping from within, he managed to work his way through the opening just as they heard shouts from the compounds. Main entrance. The returning rebels had discovered their unconscious comrades. Move, Riley whispered urgently, leading the group toward the perimeter fence. The smoke from the plantation fires was still providing some concealment, but she could hear commands being shouted in Spanish as the rebels organized a search of the compound. They reached the fence gap without being detected, but getting 4 additional people through the narrow opening proved more challenging than Riley had anticipated. Each person required assistance and guidance, and precious seconds ticked away as she helped them navigate the tight space. Dr. Martinez went through first, followed by Jennifer and James. As Michael squeezed through the gap, Riley heard the sound she'd been dreading, A shout of discovery from the direction of the main building. Someone had found the hostage room empty. "Run," Rayleigh commanded as soon as Michael cleared the fence. "Straight into the jungle, don't look back." The hostages needed no further encouragement. Despite their exhaustion and ordeal, they ran with the desperate energy of people who knew their lives depended on speed. Rayleigh brought up the rear, her weapon ready as she watched for pursuing rebels. Behind them, the compound erupted in activity. Searchlights came on despite the daytime hour, and she could hear vehicles starting up as the rebels organized pursuit teams. Worse, the plantation fires were beginning to die down, eliminating the smokescreen that had provided their concealment. They crashed through the jungle vegetation with little regard for stealth. Now speed was their only hope of reaching the extraction point before being overtaken by the rebels' vehicles. Rayleigh used her knowledge of the terrain to guide them along the fastest route, avoiding obstacles that might slow their progress. After 10 minutes of desperate flight through the underbrush, Dr. Martinez stumbled and fell, her endurance finally giving out. "I can't," she gasped. "I need to rest." Rayleigh could hear vehicle engines getting closer, along with the voices of searchers who were gaining ground. They had perhaps 5 minutes before being overtaken. "Jennifer, James, keep going straight that way," Rayleigh ordered, pointing toward the extraction zone. "The helicopter should be waiting in a clearing about half a mile ahead. Tell them we're coming with 2 more. What about you?" Michael asked, helping Dr. Martinez to her feet. Rayleigh looked at her cousin, brilliant, kind-hearted Michael, who had volunteered for medical service in a dangerous country because he wanted to help people. The same Michael who had encouraged her to join the army when everyone else thought she was making a mistake. "I'm getting both of you to that helicopter," she said simply. "No matter what it takes." Before anyone could protest, Rayleigh had Dr. Martinez positioned across her shoulders in the same carry that had impressed her teammates during the training exercise. The doctor was heavier than Lieutenant Brennan had been, and Rayleigh was already exhausted from the infiltration and rescue, but she found the strength she needed in the knowledge that failure meant death for all of them. "Stay close," she told Michael as she began moving through the jungle. "If I fall, you keep going. Get to that helicopter and get home." Behind them, the sound of pursuit was getting closer. Rayleigh could hear rebels calling to each other as they coordinated their search, and the noise of vehicles navigating the rough terrain at the jungle's edge. But ahead of them, somewhere in the green shadows, was the sound she'd been hoping to hear, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors spinning up for immediate departure. They were going to make it. Against impossible odds, with overwhelming enemy forces in pursuit, the soldier everyone had called too small was about to complete a mission that would save 4 American lives. The only question was whether they could cover the final distance before their luck ran out completely. The helicopter rotors grew louder as Rayleigh crashed through the final stretch of jungle, Dr. Martinez's weight pressing down on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers had become a constant backdrop of shouted Spanish commands and breaking vegetation as the rebel search teams closed the distance. Michael ran beside her, his medical school conditioning allowing him to keep pace despite the brutal terrain. Through gaps in the canopy ahead, Rayleigh could see the metallic glint of the extraction aircraft hovering just above the trees, its crew chief hanging out the side door with a rescue harness ready. "There!" Michael pointed toward a break in the jungle wall where Jennifer and James had already reached the landing zone. The 2 hostages were waving frantically at the helicopter, which was maintaining position about 6 feet above the ground. In the small clearing, Rayleigh felt her legs beginning to give out as they approached the extraction point. Dr. Martinez had lost consciousness during the final sprint, her body going limp across Rayleigh's shoulders in a way that made carrying her even more difficult. Every step now required conscious effort, and she could feel her endurance reserves completely depleted. "I've got her," Michael said, seeing his cousin struggle. "Let me take over." "No time," Rayleigh gasped, stumbling into the clearing where the helicopter waited. The crew chief immediately jumped down to help, grabbing Dr. Martinez and lifting her toward the aircraft's cabin. As Jennifer and James were pulled aboard, rifle shots cracked through the jungle behind them. The rebel pursuit team had reached the perimeter of the landing zone and were firing at the helicopter from concealment. Bullets whined overhead as the pilot fought to maintain position despite the hostile fire. "Move! Move! Move!" the crew chief shouted over the rotor noise, reaching down to help Michael climb aboard. Riley was the last one on the ground, and as she prepared to grab the crew chief's outstretched hand, a new sound cut through the chaos. The distinctive whine of an RPG being armed somewhere in the tree line. RPG. She screamed, throwing herself sideways as a rocket-propelled grenade streaked through the space where the helicopter had been hovering just seconds before. The pilot reacted instantly, pulling the aircraft up and away from the landing zone as the grenade exploded against a cluster of trees 50 yards beyond their position. But the evasive maneuver left Riley stranded on the ground, with rebel fighters emerging from the jungle on 3 sides. "Riley!" Michael's voice carried over the rotor noise as he leaned out of the helicopter's door. "Jump! We can catch you!" But the aircraft was already 15 feet above the ground and climbing, well beyond any possible leap. Riley found herself alone in the clearing, surrounded by advancing rebels who had finally cornered their primary target. "Land that helicopter!" shouted a voice in accented English. Through the smoke from the RPG explosion, Riley could see a man in military fatigues approaching with an AK-47 pointed directly at her chest. "Land it now, or we kill the American soldier." The rebel commander was a tall, scarred man who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed. Behind him, at least 8 fighters had emerged from concealment, their weapons trained on Riley and the hovering aircraft. "You have 10 seconds. The commander called up to the helicopter. "Land and surrender, or watch your friend die." Riley looked up at the aircraft, where she could see Michael's terrified face in the doorway. Dr. Martinez, Jennifer, and James were safe, but the pilot was faced with an impossible choice: abandon 1 soldier to save 4 hostages, or risk everyone in a futile rescue attempt. "Go!" Riley shouted up at them, her voice barely audible over the rotor noise. "Complete the mission. Get them home." But even as she said it, she could see the pilot beginning to lower the aircraft. The crew chief was already preparing another rescue harness, apparently intending to attempt a pickup despite the hostile fire. That's when Santos's voice crackled through Riley's earpiece, barely audible but unmistakably urgent. "North side, 30 seconds. Be ready." Riley understood immediately. The Special Forces instructor had been monitoring their extraction from her position near the plantation and was about to create a diversion that might give Riley one last chance to escape. The explosion, when it came, was far larger than anything Santos should have been able to create with her remaining equipment. The blast originated from the direction of the rebel compound, sending a pillar of orange flame and black smoke hundreds of feet into the air. "The ammunition depot." One of the rebels shouted in Spanish. "She's destroyed our weapons cache." The psychological effect was immediate. Half the fighters surrounding Riley turned toward the explosion, their attention diverted by the destruction of what was apparently a significant military asset. In that moment of confusion, Riley made her move. Instead of trying to reach the helicopter, which remained an impossible target, she sprinted toward the north side of the clearing where the jungle was thickest. Her small size allowed her to disappear into vegetation that would have slowed larger pursuers, and the rebels' momentary confusion gave her the head start she needed. Gunfire erupted behind her as the remaining fighters realized their prisoner was escaping, but Riley was already deep in the jungle canopy where the dense vegetation made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Bullets shredded leaves and bark around her as she weaved between trees. Using every technique Santos had taught her about moving through hostile territory, the rebel commander's voice carried through the forest as he organized pursuit teams. But Riley had advantages they couldn't match. Her knowledge of the terrain from their infiltration route, her compact size that allowed her to move through spaces they couldn't follow, and most importantly, her absolute determination to reach the secondary extraction point that Santos had briefed her about during mission planning. The backup landing zone was 2 miles deeper in the jungle, accessible only by a treacherous path that wound through rocky terrain the helicopter couldn't easily reach. It was designed as a last resort for exactly this type of situation, but reaching it would require Riley to outrun and outmaneuver a determined pursuit force through some of the most challenging landscape in South America. She ran through the Tivung jungle with the desperate energy of someone who knew that capture meant death. The rebels behind her had no reason to take prisoners now. She'd seen too much of their operation and cost them too many resources. Her only chance was to reach the backup extraction point before they caught up with her. The path to the secondary landing zone led uphill through terrain that became increasingly rocky and difficult. Riley's legs burned with exhaustion, and her lungs felt like they were on fire from the constant exertion. But she maintained her pace by focusing on the faces of the people she'd just saved. Dr. Martinez, who would return to her hospital in Atlanta to continue saving lives. James Wilson, who could go back to providing healthcare to underserved communities in Oregon. Jennifer Hayes, who would finish medical school and become the doctor she'd always dreamed of being. And Michael, brilliant, compassionate Michael, who would complete his medical training and spend his career helping people just like the villagers they'd been treating when this nightmare began. 20 minutes into her escape, Riley heard the sound that changed everything: helicopter rotors approaching from the north. The extraction aircraft had somehow circled around the rebel positions and was heading toward the backup landing zone. But she also heard something else that made her blood run cold: the sound of vehicles approaching from multiple directions. The rebels had apparently called in reinforcements and were using trucks to cut off her escape routes. The race was now between Riley's ability to reach the extraction point and the rebels' ability to surround it before the helicopter could complete the pickup. Everything would come down to timing and whether her exhausted body could cover the final mile before her pursuers closed the trap. She crested a ridgeline and could see the backup landing zone below, a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings that would provide cover from ground fire. The helicopter was already approaching, its pilot showing incredible skill in navigating the challenging terrain. But rebel vehicles were converging on the area from 3 directions, their passengers jumping out to establish firing positions that would dominate the landing zone. Riley was going to arrive at the extraction point at the same time as the enemy forces. The final sprint down the hillside was the longest, 100 yards of Riley's life. Rifle fire cracked around her as the first rebel fighters reached positions overlooking the clearing. The helicopter pilot, showing remarkable courage, brought his aircraft down despite the hostile fire, the crew chief once again leaning out. With a rescue harness, Riley reached the landing zone just as bullets began impacting her on the helicopter's landing gear. Without hesitation, she dove toward the aircraft as the crew chief threw her the rescue harness. What happened next would be debated in military circles for years to come. As Riley grabbed the harness, the helicopter pilot pulled up sharply to avoid an RPG that streaked through the space where they'd been hovering. Riley found herself dangling beneath the aircraft as it gained altitude, her feet barely clearing the treetops as rebel fighters fired at her from below. The crew chief and another soldier worked frantically to pull her up into the cabin while the pilot maneuvered evasively to avoid ground fire. For several terrifying minutes, Riley hung suspended over hostile territory, completely vulnerable to the weapons being fired at her from below. When they finally hauled her into the helicopter's cabin, she found herself face to face with Santos. who had somehow reached the extraction point ahead of the ground pursuit. "How?" Riley gasped, still catching her breath from the harrowing escape. "Commandeered one of their vehicles," Santos replied with a grim smile. "Figured you might need backup at the extraction point." As the helicopter climbed toward safe altitude, Riley looked down at the jungle that had nearly become her grave. The rebel compound was still burning in the distance, sending a column of smoke into the afternoon sky. Below them, the fighters who had held 4 Americans hostage were regrouping around their damaged base, probably wondering how a single small soldier had managed to infiltrate their operation and extract the prisoners right from under their noses. "Base. This is Rescue 1. The pilot's voice came through the intercom. "Package delivered. All hostages secured, and the extraction team recovered. To base 45 minutes. In the cabin, Dr. Martinez had regained consciousness and was examining the other hostages with professional thoroughness. Jennifer and James appeared exhausted but unharmed. Michael sat quietly, still processing the reality that his cousin, the smallest member of their family, the one everyone had always tried to protect, had just risked her life to save him. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with emotion he couldn't quite express. Riley nodded, too exhausted for lengthy conversations, but feeling a sense of completion she'd never experienced before. 6 months ago, Colonel Brennan had looked at her and seen someone too small to be a real soldier. Today, that same colonel would receive a report detailing how his smallest recruit had accomplished a mission that larger, stronger, more experienced soldiers couldn't have completed. As the Colombian jungle fell away beneath them, Riley closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel something she'd never felt before, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The helicopter carried them north toward safety, toward home, toward a future where nobody would ever again make the mistake of underestimating what the smallest person in the room might be capable of achieving. 2 hours later, Fort Richardson's airfield came into view. A small crowd had gathered to welcome the returning hostages, medical personnel, intelligence officers, and a handful of senior commanders who had monitored the mission from the operations center. Colonel Brennan stood at the front of the group, his expression unreadable as the helicopter touched down. As the hostages were helped from the aircraft and taken for medical evaluation, he approached Riley with steps that seemed slower and more deliberate than usual. "Private Chun," he said formally, then paused as if searching for the right words. "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a recognition that some of the most important qualities a soldier can have aren't visible from the outside." Riley stood at attention, her mud-stained uniform and exhausted appearance contrasting sharply with the colonel's pristine dress blues. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "No," Brennan replied, his voice carrying a weight of understanding that hadn't been there before. "You were doing something far more important than that. You were proving that courage, determination, and intelligence matter more than size, strength, or appearance. And you were saving the lives of 4 people who matter very much to their families." He paused, then extended his hand. "Welcome to the real Army soldier. The one where what you can do matters more than what you look like." As Riley shook his hand, she realized that her journey was just beginning. The mission in Colombia had proven something to herself and to others, but more importantly, it had shown her what she was truly capable of when everything was on the line. 6 months ago, she'd been too small. Today, she was exactly the right size for the job that needed to be done. And tomorrow, she'd be ready for whatever challenge came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.